Spoiler warning for Star Wars The Last Jedi and some implied spoilers for The Rise of Skywalker. So after defending a film that supports atheism and attacks the Catholic Church, I've decided to tackle an even more controversial topic: Star Wars The Last Jedi. I know it's been a couple years since it came out, but I figured now that the trilogy is over and people have had time to digest, it would be a good time to get into the most talked about film of the three. Before I do that, I'll give a warning that this will be me getting nerdy about Star Wars, and if you just don't like Star Wars as a franchise to begin with, this post won't be for you. It's more for the people who love Star Wars but The Last Jedi didn't jive with them, or for those who loved The Last Jedi and want to hear some validation for their opinions. There's a lot of videos and posts that talk about this movie already, but some of my points here I've yet to see others make, so I wanted to compile them and the other points I agree with here. Firstly, I'll give some background on my place in the Star Wars fandom. As a child, I watched the original trilogy over and over on VHS. I would then go see each of the prequels in theaters as they came out, and like with the originals, watch them repeatedly. Now with the sequels, I've enjoyed each one as they came out as well, and again have watched all of them multiple times except for the recent Rise of Skywalker. I have more issues with some of the films than others, but overall I'd say I enjoy each one. Outside of the films, I've played a lot of the games, read a lot of the books, and as embarrassing as it may be to admit, when I was younger, I'd often sit on StarWars.com reading through their database about different small details or background characters. So now that I've established how much Star Wars is a part of my life, I hope that gives me some authority to talk about the film. I do want to point out this is intended to be looked at as just what this film is, and not what it became once parts were retconned in The Rise of Skywalker. I think most people agree that the craft of the filmmakers here is not the problem. The film looks great, John Williams made another great score, the sound effects are as good as ever, and the actors all did a great job. Critics gave this film great reviews for the most part, but it's the fans that were divided on this. So we'll have to look at what character and plot elements caused these rifts. The first issues I'll give my understanding or reasoning to will just be some of the smaller issues that I think if they had been the only issues people had, it wouldn't have spoiled their opinions on the film. One of these issues is Leia's fake-out death being blasted into space. I know it even took me out of the film for a moment thinking, wait, can she survive in space? But then I remember this is Star Wars, and stuff like this has happened before. Not saying that makes it okay, but if you don't have an issue with it in other parts of the franchise, you shouldn't here. Then there's the fact she uses the Force. We have seen her use the Force to smaller degrees at this point, and it's not unreasonable to believe that she would have gotten stronger with the Force by now. Not to mention, she was in a life or death situation, and her survival instincts likely kicked in. Overall, this scene is just a bit messy, and maybe could have been done a little differently, but there are limitations to what can be done with a woman in her 60s on wires. I do want to point out, though, she isn't flying like Mary Poppins, as some would have you believe. She's using the Force to pull herself through low gravity. The next small issue would be the throne room fight's choreography. This one seems ridiculous to me that it would even need defended, as the fight looks amazing, unless you go through it frame by frame, analyzing what each person on screen is doing. If you just watch the scene like a normal person would, it looks great. In some cases you have to remember this is a film and the fights aren't always meant to look realistic, especially in a space opera, and personally I think it's better when the film uses its fights to tell us something about the characters involved. In this case, showing us Rey and Kylo's instant ability to team up, and their innovation as fighters. This is a purely subjective category. Some jokes might just land differently for each person. I personally laughed a lot through the film and had a great time. This, however, isn't anything new to Star Wars, and I would argue the humor in this film is a lot closer to that of the original trilogy than the previous ones. It just happens with a little more frequency. Some older fans should also take in mind that they were at a different age and hopefully a different mindset when they first watched the original trilogy as well. One last smaller issue is Captain Phasma. This is one I can't even defend. I think the way her whole character has been handled hasn't been very good. The best I can do is chalk it up to fulfilling a trope of Star Wars movies by having a character that looks cool but doesn't get any development. She falls in line with Boba and Jango Fett, Darth Maul, and General Grievous. I know saying those characters didn't get development will offend some people, and I get it. Boba Fett is awesome, and maybe an exception here, but it is true. Those characters have also gotten more development outside of the film since, so I can only hope they do the same for Phasma. Though the Phasma book isn't a great start to fleshing her out. Now that the smaller issues are out of the way, let's get to the real meat. One part of the film that is universally agreed upon as the weakest part of the film is Canto Bight. I will agree it is the weakest part of the film, however, when I looked at it on its own, I don't think anything is particularly wrong with it. It just kind of seems to slow the pacing down when you get the cool look into the Force with Luke, Rey, and Kylo, the tension in space between Poe and Holdo, and then hop to the casino planet. Just those scenes feel very much like part of Star Wars, though. If they were an episode of one of the TV series, I don't think people would take much of an issue with it. We get the obligatory weird new creature to the universe with the fathiers, a cool new gray character like Lando or Hondo in DJ, and in general just an interesting new setting for the Star Wars universe. The whole casino setting is meant as a metaphor. Finn and Rose's whole adventure is one big gamble by Poe. One other thing about Canto Bight that people take issue with is possible political connotations, and while I don't want to get political with this post, I don't think the connections people are making there are really accurate to the real world in the first place. The next part that seems to be the biggest deal breaker for people is the characterization of Luke Skywalker in this film. To get into his part of the story, we first must look at how he got to where he is. After turning his father away from the dark side and together defeating the Emperor, Luke became a legend, a hero that people looked up to. This got to his head, and when a young Ben Solo started to show signs of a growing darkness, in his hubris, Luke thought he could be that hero he has been hyped up to be and train him. As he senses the darkness continuing to grow in Ben, he briefly thinks he can be a hero by striking him down, likely a side effect of growing darkness within himself caused by pride. This thought, however, was fleeting, and like when he nearly struck down his own father, he came to the same realization and held back. Before continuing, I just want to point out that I love the way this is played out in the film. Rian Johnson, I believe, was making an homage to the Akira Kurosawa film Rashomon by having different characters tell the story in different ways, leaving the audience to decipher the truth before giving us the real story. Moving on, though, after Luke failed to prevent Ben from falling to the dark side, Luke, feeling the shame of not living up to the legend he had become, and seeing similarities between his teaching and the Jedi Order that allowed Palpatine to slip through the system, decides to go into exile. In an attempt to both hide himself and to have balance be returned to the Force naturally, he cuts himself off from the Force. If people have an issue with Luke cutting himself off from the Force, that's not really on The Last Jedi, as this was the only way it made sense that in The Force Awakens, Kylo, Snoke, Leia, and Rey all couldn't just feel where he was with the Force. As for Luke being disillusioned with the Jedi, I think this is something the prequels, the books, and the TV series have been showing, is that the Jedi didn't really have it right with their dogmatic views on the Force. In those, they have shown that the Jedi had lost their way, becoming more militaristic, employing spying, and obviously becoming generals in a war, instead of being the peacekeepers of the galaxy they once were. Seeing all this, Luke decides it is time for the Jedi to end, as it clearly wasn't working. One of the biggest points of contention for the film is right at the beginning, Luke throws his lightsaber away. This is a form of visual storytelling. By throwing away the symbol of the Jedi, it tells the audience Luke no longer believes in the Jedi. All his introduction is meant to show us that. While Rey might think he's a legend, he doesn't believe in himself as one. Therefore, he is shown as a bit of a slob drinking his green milk and fishing. When he teaches Rey about the Force, he is further pushed into disillusionment, when, despite his warning, she immediately goes to the darkness. Through the behaviors of Rey and the wise words of his old master Yoda, Luke finds belief in himself and learns what he must do. His arc through the story ends with him embracing the legend he had become, and giving hope, like he was always meant to do, to the future Jedi of the galaxy. Some people complain about his death, but the way he went out was as the truest Jedi. Yoda once told him a Jedi never uses the Force for attack, and only for defense, so he projects himself to Ben to hold him off and give time for the Resistance to make their escape. The amount of strain this puts on him, using this ability for such a length and to such great effect, drained him. And as he looks out on the twin suns, looking back on his life, and back to where his journey began, he becomes one with the Force. I know Mark Hamill complained about where they took the character, but I do believe that's been blown out of proportions too, with people cherry-picking certain things he said. I also think when he said those things, it was before he had full context for how Luke got to where he was. By the end of the filming process, he was fully in Rian's camp, and trusted his direction. And good on Mark Hamill for, despite disagreeing, still giving arguably his greatest performance of his career. The choice to kill off Snoke was a bold one. Many complain that they killed him off without giving us enough detail about who he was. It seemed clear to me that by killing him off, he wasn't meant to be that important, and learning who he was wouldn't have served the story. I know they have since filled in who he is through The Rise of Skywalker, but at the time it was seen as, how could someone this powerful just have come up? A lot of the complaints here, I think, come from people wanting their theories validated. But if it had turned out that he was actually Darth Plagueis, how would him telling Kylo and Rey affected them? Neither of them has any connection to Plagueis, Jar Jar, Ezra, or even Palpatine at the time. So if part of the scene was just devoted to Snoke explaining his background, it just would have been exposition for someone to fill information on the Wikipedia page, and not had any pull on the arcs of Rey or Kylo. This isn't to say his backstory isn't important to the universe, and shouldn't eventually have been filled out, but it's not important to this story. In the grander scheme, to me, the choice to kill off Snoke was meant to say that Snoke wasn't the big bad villain of this trilogy, and it's actually Kylo. It's kind of the what-if scenario if Luke had accepted joining Vader to take out the Emperor in The Empire Strikes Back, but still stays with the light side. So the question of who Rey's parents are was later answered in The Rise of Skywalker, but at the time our answer was nobody. This was probably the biggest shocker for me, as I went down the well of making theories of who her parents were. However, instead of being disappointed by the outcome, I was thrilled by it. I had wanted them to do something interesting like this, but was expecting something safe, like her just being Luke's daughter that he left when he went into exile. Her being born to nobody works very well for the story, though. Throughout The Force Awakens, Rey puts a lot of emphasis on how important it is that she goes back to Jakku to be there when her parents return. So what explanation works best for someone whose parents left their child in a place like Jakku with Unkar Plutt for so long? Well, they would have had to be pretty awful parents to do that. So do you want that to be Luke, Han, Obi-Wan, or somehow Qui-Gon? Probably not. But to Rey, she has this idea in her head that her parents must be important and away doing really big things like saving the galaxy or something. So when she finds out who they are, what's the most impactful outcome for her? Nobody. In a wider sense of the story of Star Wars, this also works. When we first met Luke, he was a nobody, farm boy whose parents at the time were just dead in an accident. Typical hero origin. Anakin is born to Shmi Skywalker, a slave, and with no father. The parents of our heroes aren't important. By having parents that aren't related to the rest of the story also makes the universe a lot bigger, and helps get the ideals of the Force away from the whole midichlorians concept. The idea that the most powerful Force users all must come from the Skywalker bloodline kind of flies in the face of Yoda's teachings. Yoda's mentality of being able to use the Force despite any physical limitations doesn't work as well if it is dependent on something like bloodlines. I like the Force being more mystical than scientific, as well as giving equal opportunity. To continue from the talk of the Force, I wanted to go over the new Force abilities we see in this film. Right off the bat, I want to say I like expanding new Force abilities, since much like in the real world, people always find new ways to use old concepts. New art forms, new techniques, new mindsets, it all works with the Force. I also like to think the more a person can give themselves into the Force, the more creative and powerful abilities they are able to do. It's just about getting past the mental blocks. This is what Yoda is talking about when he says, "Do or do not, there is no try." As for the individual abilities, first we got the Force bond between Kylo Ren and Rey. The use of shot reverse shot to show us they are occupying the same space, but see different surroundings, was just an outstanding filmmaking decision. I liked how they showed as Rey and Kylo got more comfortable with each other, the bond became more powerful, showing certain aspects of their respective settings passing to the others. I'm not sure if people have too much of an issue with this power, more so just that it hadn't been seen before. So if you think the rules of the Force have already been written, then you might take issue with this, but otherwise it probably doesn't bother you too much. The big new power that people took issue with is Luke's Force projection. I know people wanted to see him in a real fight with Kylo, but the way he did it had so much more impact. If Luke had actually shown up on Crate, as cool as it would have been to see him fight off all the First Order, there's no way he would have survived that initial blasting. And if he did, people would just be complaining he is too overpowered, so no winning there. What we did get, however, was Luke embracing the truest meaning of what it is to be a Jedi. Through using the Force projection, he is not causing any harm to anyone, and protecting as many people as he can, even the bad guys. By appearing there as a projection, he isn't going to hurt Ben, but he may impart some wisdom, and maybe even help him get back on the path to the light. His sacrifice is the ultimate form of being a Jedi, and he is able to come back more powerful than Kylo could possibly imagine. Near the end of the film is a moment where Finn tries destroying the First Order's Death Star tech battering ram by flying his ski speeder into it. But Rose stops him by essentially tackling him with her own ski speeder. To me, she was in the right, since I thought they made it fairly obvious Finn's plan wasn't going to work. Yes, it's good that Finn was willing to sacrifice himself for the cause. That was his arc. But dying needlessly wouldn't have been good. How do I know it would be needlessly? Well, Rose, an engineer, inspected the ski speeders and thought they were trashy. Poe kicked his foot through his own ski speeder, and Finn's was clearly disintegrating on the way there. Even when Rose crashes into Finn, they break into a bunch of small pieces. So crashing into the battering ram likely would have had a fly on a windshield effect. This can also be explained through it being like a Death Star. If they could have just done that, the Death Star would have been a lot easier to destroy if they just took out the part that fires the laser. As for Rose actually catching up to and hitting Finn, I think that also shows how he wasn't going to have much of an effect, since we can assume the drag being caused from being in the line of fire is slowing him down so much that Rose makes it back to him. One of the biggest complaints is people think it's a plot hole that Holdo wouldn't just tell Poe her plan from the beginning, but there are plenty of reasons why she wouldn't. Firstly, she might just not have the plan fully formed, so she's not sharing it with anyone yet. Secondly, she doesn't really have a reason to trust Poe. The last thing he did prior to Holdo taking over was get demoted for disobeying orders, which leads to a lot of resistance fighters being killed. They also can't exactly confirm the hyperspace tracking theory yet, so for all she knows, there could be a traitor or a spy on board. Her distrust in Poe is even founded by him going behind her back to risk everything with the secret mission he sends Finn and Rose on, as well as him leading a mutiny against her. One last reason why she might not tell him is that he might not agree with her plan and go against it anyways. So if he just sticks to his job and lets her do hers, they would get out of the situation relatively unscathed. I also want to go over the Holdo maneuver, ramming the Raddus in hyperspace through the First Order ships. We know that ramming one ship with another ship can do a lot of damage. Return of the Jedi had an A-Wing taking out an entire Super Star Destroyer, and nobody complained about that. There's a couple of complaints that all add up to why wouldn't they just do that all the time now? Again, there's several reasons why not. The easy answer is just costs. The Resistance doesn't have the fleet the First Order does, so each of their cruisers is much more valuable. Some people might say, why not just use small unmanned ships? And well, they do. That's just called a missile. I also think the situation leading to that working was very unique. When the First Order noticed the Raddus turning to attack position to jump into hyperspace, Hux orders that they continue attacking the smaller lifeboats. It's likely that if they had just attacked the Raddus, or if they put their focus on defending against it, such as putting full power to the forward shields, the Holdo maneuver would have failed. The jump to hyperspace also coincides with the splitting of the lightsaber, which has a Kyber crystal inside it, which we know powers the Death Star. So it's likely that the charge from it mixed with the power of the coaxium in the hyperspace drive likely had some effect on the explosion. They do go on to say it was very extreme odds in The Rise of Skywalker, but they also undo some of that at the end. But that's an issue for that film. A lot of people seem to take a different meaning from this film than I do, even some that like the movie like me. Many see Kylo's line, "kill the past," as being the theme. And I guess I could see how. The film does subvert many of the usual Star Wars tropes. However, in my eyes, the message is about learning from the past and growing beyond it. I think Kylo being the villain tells us that what he's saying is wrong. Also, by trying to kill the past, he's just ignoring it and not able to move on from it. His confliction is still there from the previous film. That's why I've been occasionally calling him Ben throughout, since he's still in there. Whereas Rey learns from the past. Luke tells her of the failure of the Jedi, of the light, the dark, and the balance between. After learning from Kylo about her parents, she comes close to joining his side and trying to just move on from it, but instead she embraces being Rey from nowhere. She becomes the new and improved version of a Jedi, and lives in that balance where the Force belongs. Poe learns from his past too. At the beginning of the film, Poe is the hotshot pilot who feels justified in everything he does because he thinks he's good enough to get away with it. He disobeys orders, and each time, while it might work, it comes at a huge cost. First, when he decides to take on the Dreadnought, they manage to take it out, but they lose all of their bombers in the mission. Next, when he goes behind Holdo's back and sends Finn and Rose to find the Codebreaker, they find a Codebreaker, but he sells them out to the First Order. In the end, he realizes some things aren't worth the cost. In the Battle of Crate, they could keep trying to take out the battering ram, but he sees it's not going their way and orders a retreat to save more lives, even if it's less heroic. Luke learns from his failures with Ben, and later from Rey. He let his fame go to his head when he was dealing with Ben's dark side. He let Ben fall because he was unable to allow himself to see there will always be a bit of darkness in everyone. The same issue comes up again with Rey when she immediately goes to explore the darkness. He becomes afraid to teach her more, but after having a conversation with Yoda, who literally points out the theme, he puts his trust in Rey, for the future of the Jedi embraces his role. I think Rian Johnson has had a rough deal with how people have treated him on the internet, and yet he seems so welcoming to other people's opinions of his movie. I think this comes from him having an open mind in his position, that art is subjective and is always open to interpretation. The fact that two people can talk about his film and have such vastly different views on it speaks to the fact that it is a work of art. He created a film that stokes conversation and even gets across some deeper and more critical thinking in a franchise that has generally been very shallow popcorn flicks. He had the very unenviable task of making a film that follows up The Force Awakens, but doesn't just copy Empire Strikes Back. Watching interviews and behind-the-scenes footage, it seems so clear how passionate he is about Star Wars and filmmaking. If you think he was attempting to sabotage the franchise, you haven't looked into him enough. The man knew what he was doing and had such a clear, singular vision to make the best Star Wars film with what was handed to him. He made this whole film despite everything that was against him, going from small indie projects to his first blockbuster. Actual Russian bots on Twitter threatening him, an actor who disagreed with him, and then all the backlash. I hope Disney moves forward with creating his trilogy, and I very much can't wait to see what he does with an entirely new setting for Star Wars. This post was in the works for a while now. I kept starting it and restarting, trying to figure out the best way to cover this. The landscape surrounding Star Wars has become rather treacherous. The fact that I felt the need to justify my place in the Star Wars fandom at the start should say quite a lot about how hard it is to talk about without just being dismissed as not a real fan. When really, if you like anything related to Star Wars, the original trilogy, the prequels, the sequels, the spin-offs, the books, the games, the toys, anything, you are a Star Wars fan. I tried just going through the whole film, but that was going to be way too long, and this still ended up with over 5,000 words. I tried going by character, but some of the topics either didn't belong with any character or they belonged to multiple characters and were repeated. So the best way I could find was to try to just address the issues as best I could, even if that means selling the great parts of this film short. I probably missed some issues, but to be honest, I have such a positive view of this film, it's hard not to just dismiss some of the issues that people have come up with. I'm not trying to say that all criticisms of the film aren't valid, because there certainly are things that could be better, but where there are issues, I can find ways to clarify them that work for me. I did a lot of research for this, watching the movie with and without the commentary, watching the making of documentary, and gathering opinions from others through reviews, videos, and podcasts, both positive and negative. I'd like to say a favorite scene from the film, but there's so many good ones to choose from. The Yoda one, I think it perfectly captured the atmosphere of Star Wars and felt nostalgic without feeling like it was pandering. Everything once it's on crate is fantastic, from the battle with the high contrast of red on white to what seemed like the perfect farewell to Carrie Fisher. It's all just so good. I would love to hear what people think of this film. I know it's a controversial topic on the internet, but I've only actually met 2 people in real life that didn't like it. And one of those I'm pretty sure was just riding the hate train without actually taking his own critical look at the film. I think this film got judged unfairly by fans who spent the 2 years leading up to the release theorizing and creating lofty expectations, and then hating it because the film they had created in their heads wasn't the end product, which didn't give the film a chance to be what it is. A film shouldn't be criticized for what it isn't, and not having your wish fulfillment doesn't make the movie worse. If you do genuinely dislike this film, I'm not hoping this changed your mind, as you should come to that on your own, but hopefully this gives you a better understanding of how someone like myself would love this film, and maybe you'll give it another chance. Thanks for watching.